Thanks, Sandra.
Welcome to the Civic License meeting. As you're all aware, we are going to have a 1 minute silence for Queen Elizabeth II. If we could start that now, 1 minute silent, please, before we convene the meeting. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. Do we have any apologies for this meeting today?
There's no apologies, convener.
Do we have any declarations of interest? Councillor Ross Gregg.
Thank you, convener. Whilst I don't have an interest to declare in relation to item 6 for the purposes of transparency, I'd like it to be known that prior to my election as councillor, I did participate in the position as host with Airbnb for a short-term let property, but I've stopped doing that, so it's just for the purposes of transparency.
That's great, thank you for letting us know. Councillor Jill Scott.
Hi, with regard to item 6, I've received calls, but I'll be taking part in the meeting because I've not had any conversations. Okay.
That's great, thank you very much. Okay, can we have the minutes of the minutes of the last meeting? Are they approved? Okay, thank you. Agreed. Item 4 today is delegated. Is that report agreed?
Agreed.
Number 5 is the taxi report. Do we agree the recommendations that no charges to be applied at the moment? Councillor Meehan? An old hand, was that in you?
Yeah, no, it's with regard to the finances. I'm on the correct part for
Okay.
22-23.
Okay.
It was just whether the costs associated to the committee include sorry, bear with me. I'm trying to find where I was.
I think it's page 15.
Yeah.
Page 15.
It's page 50.
Yeah.
Yep. Whether they include any legal challenge to the budget.
Yeah, I think we could ask Ms Magson on that. Yeah, you're on mute just now. Are you still on mute?
Sorry, apologies. Do you mean appeal?
Councillor Meehan, you're on mute, I think. Can't hear you. Yeah.
I think he might be frozen, Councillor Donald.
Yeah. Give him a wee minute, see if he comes back.
Might need to put off his camera again.
Yeah, signal's never very good up at Kirriemuir, is it? Really. Councillor Meekin, do you want to put your camera off? Aye. Oh, Councillor Nichols over there now. How did that happen? There's change.
I think
He's
Councillor Meekin's put his camera off, convener.
Okay. I think it's probably just needing to, have some kind of analysis of the figures. That's maybe something we can talk to him about later on. That be possible?
Councillor Meekin, are you hearing us? Oh no, he's left. If you just give him maybe a few minutes to comes back into the meeting.
Apologies, councillors. I did have my hand up for a separate matter. It's just to again ask that we go through each recommendation one by one.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting, I'll read out the recommendations if that's okay. It's recommended that the committee notes the legal obligations incumbent upon the council in relation to the fees in respect of taxi and private hire driver and operating licences.
Convener, I think if we just maybe
You'll
give
need to wait
Councillor
for
Meekin
Councillor
just
Meekin.
just a minute to come back in.
Fiona, it's Karen. I've requested Councillor Meekin to join. It's actually Colin, so I don't know if he's actually managed to connect as yet, but it is calling him.
John, could we maybe pause the live stream just now till we get Councillor Meekin back in? Oh, I think he's back. I think that's Councillor Meekin back in the meeting, convener.
Okay. Councillor Meekin, can you hear me?
Hear you now.
I feel like I'm doing a seance here. Yeah, what was the particular issue that you were looking at on the recommendation?
It was a question on the budget. The question was, have there been any legal challenges, and if there have, are they included in the budget? The cost of them included in the budget?
You mean appeals, Councillor Meekin?
Yes.
Is that what you're thinking?
Yes.
I'm not aware that there. Do you mean for this year and the following year, effectively? I'm
Yes.
not aware that there's been any appeals in relation to this specific area. There have been appeals in other areas, as you're aware of, but not in this specific area. It is quite a narrow remit for this particular report.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Madsen, do you want me to read the recommendations or do you want to read them out?
No, Councillor, convener, that
Yeah.
would be you. We just need to go through each one because each one asks for board approval or not, effectively, or noting.
Okay. Recommendations is notes the legal obligations incumbent upon the council in relation to fees in respect of taxi and private hire driver and operation licences. Notes the actual 2021-2022 and estimated budget of 22-22 and 20-2023 income received and expenditure incurred in respect of taxi and private hire driver and operated licence as contained in Appendix 1 to this report. We agreed to make no change to the fees to be charged in respect of taxi and private hire operators and drivers' licences in respect of the period 1st of September 2022 to 31st August 2023. And we note that the fees in respect of taxi and private hire licences will be reviewed following the end of the financial year 22-22 and 2023, with a view to setting fees to be applied with effect from the 1st of September 2023. Are these recommendations agreed with the board?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Convener, item number 6, the short-term lets. In the call today is Caroline Miller from the Hideaway Experience, and we've also got Fiona Campbell in, and they've both requested to address the committee members on the subject.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Who's the first speaker, please?
It's Mrs. Miller.
Mrs. Miller, would you like to speak on the short-term lets, please?
Thank you very much. So my name's Caroline Miller. I'm a farmer and I've run a tourism business on our farm in Angus with my husband Ross just since 2005. We're located between Ochterhouse and Teeling. We have 5-star accredited hideaways for couples. We're the top rated TripAdvisor on it for Dundee and Angus. We employ 5 part-time people and 1 full-time manager and myself, and we welcome between 1,500 and 2,000 wealthy and high-spending guests to the area every year. My points I would like to make about the short-term lets is, first of all, we are an agri-tourism business and we are located on a farm like many other accommodation businesses in Angus, and this is a growing sector, and there's been growing consumer demand for people to visit farms and to enjoy reviving their physical and mental health by well-being, space, freedom and fresh air and good food. My particular concerns is that the short-term lets is a sort of one-size-fits-all blanket approach. It's been obviously designed to address particular issues that are in particular parts of the country, for example, in city centres. And it's going to impact our business significantly, not just from the increased costs of the licenses, but also the bits that I'm most concerned about are the optional additional items, which I think have been designed to deal with nuisance noise in cities, which I feel have no relevance whatsoever to a remote agri-tourism business like ourselves. Our whole business is built on people being able to relax together as one couple, honeymoon couples, people celebrating special occasions. The options of that they can't use a hot tub after 9 o'clock at night, or a barbecue after 9 o'clock at night, or somebody couldn't arrive back from a night out in Dundee after 11 o'clock at night, or arrive from their wedding reception to the hideaways after 11 o'clock at night. They are these, if they were applied to our business, they would put us out of business. The whole ethos of somebody coming to stay is a relaxation. It's not impacting on anyone at all if somebody is relaxing in the hot tub, watching the stars at midnight where we are. I feel very concerned about this legislation, as I say, being applied across the board and not taking into account the many great agri-tourism and rural tourism businesses in Angus, where that ability to just relax and do your own thing, and you're not creating a noise or anything. As I say, the main thing are these additional optional items for myself. They would put us out of business, and we certainly would not be going round every night at 9 o'clock hauling people out of a hot tub or telling them they can't use a barbecue or sit on the deck. So as I say, I am concerned about costs for our business after coming out of COVID, and it feels, just the burden of regulation. It feels like very difficult to do business these days. We are a proper business. We are, as I say, we've been running a professional business since 2005. We make a big contribution to the economy locally and the profile of tourism in Angus. And I would just urge you to make sure that there isn't, that we don't take measures that have been designed for particular small examples of nuisance behaviour in cities and apply them across the board in Angus.
Great,
Thank you.
Thank you very much for explaining your business to us. Is there another applicant coming on?
Yes.
Christopher?
Yes, convener, there's Mrs. Fiona Campbell in the call. Mrs. Campbell.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you this morning. I really appreciate the time that you're taking to consider this. Caroline Miller is one of the Association of Scotland Self-Caterers members. I represent 1,470 members, all of whom have got professional, legitimate businesses the length and breadth of Scotland. And we contribute £867 million to the Scottish economy. We are not nuisance operators. We're not occasional hosts. These are our livelihoods and our lives. And this piece of legislation is going to detrimentally impact the lives and livelihoods of my members. That is absolutely for sure. Now, we completely agree, of course, with most of the mandatory conditions pertaining to health and safety. Absolutely, that's absolutely not a problem whatsoever. But these additional conditions that local authorities are introducing across different local authority areas are astonishing in some situations, I have to say. Now, one of the clearest things coming out of all the different draft policies, including Angus, I'm afraid to say, is the presumption of bad practice. And frankly, there's no business incentive whatsoever for our guests not to comply with good behaviour and good practices. But throughout the draft policy, there's a lot of must. The licence holder must do this, and the licence holder should ensure that. It's very difficult for a self-catering operator to ensure that their guest does something, for example, putting the rubbish in the correct container. We can request and we can encourage, but given that your guests may be coming from Highland or Dumfries and Galloway, where there are different rubbish situations, it's very difficult to ensure that our guests are putting rubbish in the correct container. Now, I've been a self-caterer for 20 years. I've been trying to ensure that happens for 20 years. It's physically impossible. We can only do our best. And the other thing is that in my area, I'm Argyll and Bute, you'll be pleased to hear, I can ensure that my bins are put out correctly, but Argyll and Bute doesn't pick up my bins. So that's going to impact on my licence. So it's really important that Angus Council actually looks at the enforceability of some of these additional conditions. One of them, as Caroline's quite rightly mentioned, is the external garden area, including any facilities located in the garden, such as hot tubs, swimming pools, bars or barbecues, shall not be used after 9 o'clock at night. You can go to the pub garden out next door, but you can't sit in a hot tub after 9 o'clock. Why? What's the evidence that's created that policy? Now, if you are overlooked by a neighbour, that's one thing. But if you're Caroline Miller, who's got hot tubs in the middle of nowhere, very much designed for people to enjoy their own space and their own company in the stars, that's completely inappropriate. So it's, as Caroline says, it's this one size fits all. We have to look at this a little bit more carefully. What is the evidence that there is a problem? Is there a problem with people in private residential tenancies? Is there a problem in people's own gardens? Why are we assuming that there's a problem associated with self-caterers having hot tubs in the garden? Again, amplified music shall not be played in the garden area or in any part of the property such that it can be heard in the garden area at any time. Angus Council is going to have to identify what amplified music is, because your idea of amplified music and my 16-year-old idea of amplified music is two very different things. And then if we're looking at noise monitoring devices, we're going to need to look at calibration. We're going to need to look at how this is evidence before it's a problem. So again, there's just issues that we need to be quite clear about, that we have an opportunity to get this right and for you to not have a negative impact on the legitimate businesses across your region that are so valuable to your tourism sector. So there's all of that. And then, it's the enforceability. And I think what's happening here with this draft policy is you're actually burdening the licensing authority and the licensing standards officers and everybody else that's going to have to enforce this. And that's something that you have to kind of address. If it's not enforceable, that's an incompetent. And we want to avoid that because it's just regulation for regulation's sake. One interesting point is the issue of plans. Appendix C, point 2, notes that a short-term let licensing application must include a layout plan of 1 to 100, which should include a legend explaining the scale used, etc., etc. Now, let's just remember that the plans are about ascertaining the maximum occupancy of a property. Now, when we're talking about one of Caroline's properties, very clearly maximum occupancy is 2. I've got a 5-bedroom Victorian house in Argyll and Bute. It's got 5 bedrooms. It sleeps 10 plus 2. It's been sleeping 10 plus 2 for 20 years. But to deliver the plans on this sort of technical level is going to cost me £600 plus VAT. We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Any additional cost associated with this legislation is going to be hugely damaging to small businesses that are dealing with a perfect storm of this legislation coming out of the pandemic, consumer behaviour completely changing. I don't know about Caroline, but my bookings have completely fallen off a cliff. I don't have any bookings coming in. So any additional spend at the moment in association with cost of living crisis, fuel bills, insurance hikes, all of this stuff, £600 suddenly becomes an awful lot of money. So does £588 for a licence, which we have to front load. You know, we're having to pay this now in the middle of the worst challenge we have ever faced as a sector. We thought COVID was bad. This is worse, I can promise you. So I would just urge that the councillors present and the licensing authority and the local authority really look at what they're trying to achieve with this legislation. There are some local authorities, Borders, Dumfries and Galloway, that are taking a much lighter approach. And I would just encourage you to look at some of those better practices. In terms of fees, yours aren't the worst. They're certainly not the best. In Shetland, for example, the maximum fee they're charging is £208 for a licence. Now, given that the context of this is within, I know it's completely different, but private residential tenancies, it's £82 to address all of this. Why is it costing up to £588 to address this now for short-term lets? Why are we looking at short-term lets in such a discriminatory way compared to any other kind of accommodation provision? So, as I say, thank you so much. I would be absolutely delighted to take any questions, or anybody's very welcome to contact me afterwards. There's an interesting piece on our ASSC website, that's the Association of Scotland Self-Caterers website, which illustrates some of the inconsistencies across the different local authorities and how different local authorities are looking at this subject. So please feel free to go and have a look and see what your peer local authorities are doing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Fiona Campbell, for explaining things on the Visit Angus experiences. We obviously are looking at all the details and taking in all the advice from everybody at the moment. I think we have some of our council officers that want to talk on this. If there's any questions for Fiona Campbell or the lady from the Hideaway experience, if any of the members want to ask any questions at the moment. I can't see any hands at the moment. Just lost my page there. I would just like to ask the officers if they have any presentations or anything they want to come in at the moment with on the policy. Mrs. Anderson, are you there? I've lost her.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, thanks.
I don't know if members have questions for officers.
Can't see any hands up at the moment. Oh,
I think Councillor Melville.
Yeah, here we go. Just took a wee minute there for everybody to get their hands up. Councillor Melville, then Councillor Whiteside, and then Councillor Meakin.
Thanks very much, convener, and thank you for the presentations that we've had from the industry. I think it's really important that we do hear from people involved in the industry, especially who've been in the industry for a long time. It was more a point of clarity, and just so that I have this in my head, and potentially also for the public record, because what I've heard from both the presentations that we've had so far is concerns about the additional proposals in Appendix G. And it was just to clarify and sort of put on the record that these are not conditions that Angus Council is currently proposing. They are possible conditions that we have the power to implement if we so choose in certain situations. Tina, is that your understanding of it? Have I read that correctly?
Yes, Councillor Melville, as per the report, that's a matter for the committee to consider and determine today. So this is the determination of the matters pertaining to short-term lets today. No decisions have been made. Obviously, I as an officer had to draft a policy to be able to consult with the public, and you've heard, I thought perhaps there would be more people here, to be honest with you, and you've heard from some members of the sector. So yes, there's nothing, only committee members will make any decisions about this today.
Thank you. I just think that was an important point of clarity. Thanks.
Councillor Whiteside.
Thanks, convener, and thanks, Caroline and Fiona. Much of what you said is exactly what I was thinking when I was reading through the report. Given that we've been operating without these this licensing system up until now very successfully, as far as I'm aware, I think we have to make a decision to implement the legislation with as light a touch as we possibly can. I would be proposing that we don't consider any additional conditions, because I don't think it would be proportionate, although retaining the power to do in individual circumstances if there was a problem that arose later. I'm looking very closely at some of the other items in the report. I also am a bit uncomfortable about the proposed costs. I realise that the licensing team have to cover their costs, but I think we really need to look very carefully. If we are given this the lightest possible touch that we can, perhaps the costs won't be as high as they've initially expected, and I very much hope that we can reduce them, because I don't think they're entirely proportionate. And I want to ask also if we can reduce the list of items that we require from our tourist businesses, because items such as the plans that have already been mentioned, it seems a bit overly bureaucratic, and I want to cut down the bureaucracy wherever we can. So can we cut down this list? Do we need absolutely everything on this list as a condition of getting the licence? Thanks.
Can anyone answer that at the moment, Ms Madsen?
Yes, there are other officers in relation to ECP planning and Ms Tom on the call as well. So the draft policy and the draft application form was drafted with reference to the order itself and the Scottish Government guidance, the planning guidance, the guidance for hosts and operators, and also the guidance for licensing authorities. So within guidance, the Scottish Government indicates that with regard to additional information that local authorities may request, and the Scottish Government recommends that they do request additional information. So would say to you, officers, that I have drafted it in as broad a terms as purely because I wanted it to come before you for consideration. I've highlighted and read the matters that have been raised in the public consultation documents. With regard to most of the matters that are raised in the documents are requested and the information that is required for a tick box, my view is that they are necessary in line with assessing the application in terms of the mandatory conditions. I take Mrs Campbell's point and some of the other points that were raised within the public consultation about plans not having to be in electronic format, etc., etc. That was the thinking behind that, came from the Licensing Scotland Act 2005, which does require very specific detailed plans in terms of that piece of legislation, but there's no requirement for you to have them that detailed. As I said, I tried to make it as broad as possible because this essentially what I have done is try to follow what the Scottish Government have told us to do, which is about safety primarily. The aims are in the report, councillors, and that I would ask you to always come back to what do the Scottish Government, or what have they said about the aims of this Act, what is the Act and the scheme to do. With regard to, my view would be that you definitely require the certificate of compliance. The EPC is in the conditions. It doesn't apply to every type of short-term let, but it's also required for the register if you ask for that. Insurance, building and public liability, they're both referred to in the conditions. Legionella, gas safety, smoke detectors, again, that's in red. I wonder if Mrs. Tom can come and give some information about smoke detectors and whether they should be wired or not. Pack testing is also in the mandatory conditions. So you have all the information before you, councillors. With regard to this, you have the guidance, which you've obviously looked at and considered. I wonder whether Mrs. Plum can give some view on the smoke detectors.
Mrs. Tompkins, do you want to come in before I ask any of the rest of the councillors any more questions?
Yeah, certainly in terms of this, and if you don't mind, I'd like to make comment on the layout plans as well. Personally, I feel that the layout plans are essential in assessing applications. Officers would have to look at more things than just the occupancy. It would be escape routes, escape widths. None of this could be assessed without going out on site if there was no adequate plans. And certainly, you know, I think Tina said it all about, you know, the relevance of the plans and that they don't have to be digital, something that just allows officers to check that. Otherwise, effectively, officers would be out on site checking these in person, and that may have an impact on costs as well. So I think the two are related, and it does come under safety. In terms of the smoke detection, I believe, and I'm not the expert on this at all, I believe, you know, this is linked to the tolerable standard, and that allows for 10-year battery life, interconnected smoke and fire detection. And they do not have to be hardwired unless there's a building warrant involved. So I don't know if you've got any questions on that, but certainly, hopefully that covers a little bit of information.
Okay, thank you. I think Councillor Meakin wanted to come in. I'll get Mrs. Campbell and Caroline from the VHDW in once I get the councillors in. Okay, Councillor Meakin.
Thank you, convener. Upon reading this report, there are two parts to it. I mean, part one is what is actually discretionary. So what can we actually change, and what does the law lay down? So if the law lays something down, then it's pretty pointless us going into any depth of discussion on it because it's mandatory. It would have been, I think, nice to see exactly what was mandatory and what was discretionary. So that would have made it a bit easier for us. On the discretionary, and now I know there's quite a bit in there, and there's quite a bit in there that wouldn't apply to a property in a rural situation. The question, I think, is that if we got rid of all of those, how would we then enforce something in, say, Broth? And I'm thinking off the top of my head, something like, I've got a back garden and a block of flats, and I've got a hot tub out there, and I want to play music at the time. Now, if we don't have anything, could we enforce that in any way? And obviously to something which is very rural, where you're not going to bother anyone, but it's just in a sense having the tools in the box. Could we do anything if we didn't have anything? Thank you.
Okay, quite an awkward question to ask there. Obviously, discretionary by property basis is what we're kind of looking for here. I don't know if there's anybody to answer that question at the moment. I think the next question we've got is from Kenny, Councillor Brace. Is maybe concurring with this one. Kenny, are you there?
Well, thank you very much, convener, and thank you to Ms. Miller and Ms. Campbell for their very eloquent presentations. I would agree entirely with Councillor Whiteside on this. We're really, I think, got to be looking for the lightest touch that we can manageably find. And Councillor Meakin is entirely correct. The mandatory stuff we can't do anything about. We need to, I suppose, concentrate on the stuff that we can do something about. And one size doesn't fit all, certainly not in Angus. I think Councillor Meakin's point about what might happen in a tenement where flat let for holidaymakers is entirely different to what might happen in, say, Caroline's business. So what we really need is something that can cope with all where issues arise. I think I fully take on board these points about bureaucracy. This is something you didn't have to cope with before, and now it's been, I suppose, foisted upon you, and you know that under his expense. I would say on that one that you know, the length of the license is important here, because you know you have this to go through once at the start, and then you're not bothered with it again till the next time you have to apply for a license, and there's not going to be any great change. Your application, when you come up for renewal, might look very, very similar to your application, your initial application. Maybe I could get a wee bit of help from officers here. When it comes to layout plans, I listened to what Ms. Tom had to say, why there might be compelling reasons for a layout plan. But I would point out that at the previous meeting, just prior to this one starting, was the licensing committee, and we were presented with a layout plan which was very neat and tidy, but it certainly didn't look like it had cost £600 to produce. And what standard, Ms. Tom, would we be looking for in a layout plan? Would the plan that was presented to us at the previous licensing board, would that sort of plan be suitable in your opinion for this purpose?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. Certainly hand-drawn plans, which are maybe not to scale, would be accepted in my opinion, if it provided all the relevant information for officers to assess. So, for example, if you take the fire alarms as a good example, or a smoke alarm, smoke detector, if that is shown in a hallway and it's shown in the wrong place, we're going to be asking questions about that. It may well be in the right place, and therefore, you know, the plans to scale would be more relevant. But not every situation is the same, and we've talked about that. And there's no one size fits all. If this is a small flat and it can be hand drawn and everything as detailed is on it, I would imagine that would be suitable for officers' needs. Hopefully that answers your question.
Well, I would have thought if it's acceptable to the licensing committee, it should be acceptable to any civic licensing matter too.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Right, thanks. Councillor Gregg, you've been waiting a wee minute.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I have to agree with Councillor Bestside that there is so much bureaucracy and red tape within this. It is very much a one-size-fits-all thing. Fine if you're in Edinburgh or Glasgow or a major city, but here in Angus and even Aberdeenshire, Elgin and Moray, they're all very rural part. Looking through some of the bits from the Scottish Government's guidance, there are so many bits in there that just aren't going to fit. You're effectively wanting all of these businesses to effectively become hotels and meet the same standards that is expected from a hotel. As has been mentioned, hot tubs and outdoor activities after 9 p.m. not acceptable. That's not going to work when you're halfway up Glen Esk and there's the closest place to you is half a mile or a mile down the road. There's other little bits as well. Again, for the rural part, that carpets have to be in kitchens. How is that going to work in a rural setting where you've got somewhere that's dog friendly, or you've got hikers and then they're trailing mud and everything in? You're then going to increase the costs of the running of that property because you've got to have carpets in it. It's unhygienic if you've got wet dogs and all that going about. So yeah, I would agree completely with Councillor Besside that we need to sort of do the absolute minimum so that it still appeals to the local businesses and stop people out of business because of fear of the administration of costs. Of course, I would welcome all of the health and safety things there because that's there for the public safety, and you can't disagree with that. But there are so many bits within it that are just it seems to be clearly focused on towns and cities rather than the vast majority of Scotland being completely rural.
Thank you for that, Councillor Gregg. And Councillor Jill Scott.
Hiya, yeah, I've been contacted by residents that are next to short-term let whose life is made misery with things like the hot tub, you know, or music or noise in the garden or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I'm obviously Brecon and Edsall, so I have very rural areas and, you know, Glen areas where there's, you know, pods and no neighbours and all the rest of it. But then also in the town, I do have people that have neighbours as well. So I do have short-term lets, that have neighbours, and they're unable to enjoy their own living space. You know, they're unable to enjoy their garden. Their children are being weakened. So yeah, no, I totally agree with what everybody's saying. It just can't be one size fits all. It just can't, because we're all very different. And the last thing I think we would ever want to do is put any of the sort of rural businesses out of business. We want to encourage tourism as much as possible. You know, I'm very grateful to the speakers that spoke today. I mean, 867 million to the Scottish economy is incredible. So I don't think we want to hamper that in any way, but it can't be one size fits all. Definitely not from my experience here anyway.
Thanks for that. The lady Caroline from the sorry, I forgot the terminology of your businesses. Fiona, can you correct me on Caroline's business again? The wee.
Yes, it's the Hideaway Experience. She apologised.
The wee Hideaway. I was a bit to see that. Yes, you wanted to come and speak again, and I'll get Fiona in after yourself.
Sorry, Caroline's actually had to run away because she's actually being filmed on this subject by the BBC as we speak. So sincere apologies, and she sends her thanks, but she's run off to go talk to the BBC. Thanks again. Thank you very much for all your comments. They're really valued, and it just honestly is so refreshing to have this conversation, because I'm not having this conversation with every single local authority. So I really value you taking the time to have these conversations. I think you've hit the nail on the head. One size fits all simply does not work in this situation. What's really critical to say, I'm referring to the question about mandatory conditions, Councillor Meakin. Just to be very clear, mandatory conditions are fit and proper person. The property meets the repairing standard, which frankly is ridiculous, because we wouldn't get very many guests if it wasn't meeting the repairing standard, would we now? The EPC is existing legislation. We've needed to have an EPC in secondary letting since 2010. Fire safety is still being enforced by Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. That's still, nothing has changed. There's no legislative change. So Ms. Tom, who's talking about the safety, you're absolutely right. Nothing of that has changed. All the properties should be operating within the fire safety legislation as existing. Now, that fire safety legislation already asks questions about fire alarms and fire safety, and it also talks about escape routes and so on. So actually the plans in the legislation as it's written do not demand that at all. It's about assessing what the maximum occupancy is. That's what the plans are for. So, and again, using the sort of 2005 Act licensing plans is over and above what's necessary here. The 2005 Licensing Act plans clearly need to identify lots and lots of different people being in one hospitality setting. So clearly that's much more complicated than somebody going and staying in a cottage in the country. What we're talking about is if, say, I send in an application to the licensing authority and I say I've got 5 bedrooms and I sleep 42, you might want to ask questions. But if I say I've got a 5-bedroom house and I sleep 10 and I've got a sofa bed in the sitting room, which is another 2, you're probably going to go, all right. And when people talk about the plans, it's very, very difficult to do your own plans. Very, very difficult. So asking for that level of detail from a micro that simply does not have the resource or capability to do that is unnecessary. So, for example, Perth and Kinross has said they've scaled all of that right back, as have Borders, as have Dumfries and Gallery, and said they want a number of rooms, how many people you're sleeping, that'll do. That's all that's needed here. So the safety is already covered by the Fire Safety Act, and the plans is to assess the maximum occupancy. It shouldn't be any more complicated than that. Carrying on with the mandatory conditions, you've got gas safety, existing legislation. EICR, that was not legal compliance before. It was best practice, but not legal compliance. So that's a new one, but it's to do with safety, not arguing. Portable appliance testing was best practice previously. It is now law. Not arguing, that's safety. Building insurance, totally fine. Public liability insurance, of course, completely fine. Make sure that it's 2 million as the minimum, because some local authorities are putting it down as 5 million. It's 2 million in this instance. Private water supplies, that's it. That is your mandatory conditions. Now, all of those are covered by existing legislation, and that's really important to note. The additional conditions is where we start getting into murky water. Now, I completely understand the concerns about residential amenity if you've got neighbours, but there's already existing legislation pertaining to antisocial behaviour. Now, if you have an issue where you think that you've got problems with your neighbours, then make an additional condition, noise monitoring, where necessary. So if there is a problem, repeated problem, and you're getting correspondence from your constituents, at least then you'll have the evidence to back up the antisocial behaviour legislation that is already in existence. Let's not duplicate different regulatory systems. It's already there. The antisocial behaviour legislation is specific to holiday homes. You know, it's there. Let's not complicate. As I say, mandatory safety, fire safety already covers escape routes and all of that stuff. Let's not all give ourselves more work. I mean, this is getting silly. And the other thing is length of the licence. So at this point, local authorities can give a licence for 3 years. After that, they have the ability to give the licence for any length of time. North Ayrshire, at the point of renewal after 3 years, is going to give them licences for 10 years. That's very, very welcome, because as you quite rightly say, what's going to change? Clearly, if it changes hands, then it's a new licence anyway. But, you know, if we look at this sensibly, and the problem is people are leaving the sector in droves already. And I promise you that little B&Bs are not going to be able to cope with this level of bureaucracy and cost. They are not. And that is a real. And the other thing I'd really be interested to know is, and I know this is not pointing the finger at Angus in any way, shape or form, but no local authorities know how many of these short-term lets there are in their areas. So how many self-catering units are there? How many bed and breakfasts are there? How many unlicensed guest houses, which do fall within the scope of the legislation? How many glamping pods are there? I would be interested to find out, how have we got to the figures that we've got to on a cost recovery basis? Because given that we don't know how many there are, I can't tell you, you can't tell me. It seems arbitrary that Shetland's charging 208. You're not worst in class, though. Aberdeenshire's charging £3,100 for 12 plus. Oh, yes, they are. Perth and Kinross, 1,600 for 11 plus. I mean, where are these figures coming from, would be my question. And these are small micro businesses. I'm not talking about the occasional host that annoys the next door neighbour. I'm talking about people's livelihoods, people's businesses, and that's who I represent, and that's who we need to protect. Sorry, that's me. I'm a little bit passionate about this subject because I care.
Sorry, convener, just to let you know that Claire from Peel Farm has now managed to join the call. I don't know if Claire wishes to add anything or not, because she was had difficulty getting into the meeting.
Yes, I did see that she was on the call. I wasn't sure if she wanted to talk or if she was just watching the call. So if Claire wants to say anything towards the discussion, that would be fine.
I'd just like to say that I think Fiona's just said it all there, and it's a huge worry for us all. Actually, you know, it's really tough times at the moment anyway, and this is just you know, exacerbating it all. So, but I really do think Fiona has said it all there, but I think all the councillors have also, from what I've caught of the meeting, have understand how difficult it is for us all, and we certainly don't want to lose any tourism businesses, but that really is what's happening. Fiona's right. You know, people are giving it up, and it's a very dicey situation. So hopefully everything will be taken on board, and it certainly isn't a one size fits all, but you all know that. So I'll leave it there, but I really do think Fiona spoke excellently there. Thank you for letting me join.
Thank you very much. Obviously, this is new policy that's come into place, and we have to look at it, and anything that we can amend, that we're allowed to amend to fit our region, is what we will do. It's just us getting our lawyers to make sure that we're covering ourselves for all the legal things that we have to do that are mandatory, and obviously other things that we can do to help our licensees to be successful. So we are going to work as a council to do that. It's just making sure we've covered all the bases at the moment. Councillor Gregg.
Thank you, Convener. Sorry, just one more question as I was flicking through bits there, possibly for Tina or possibly Fiona. I presume then that if we were to go with the approach where we have the sort of the minimum conditions to make it as easy as possible for business holders, I presume that once a license is granted, we would then have the same powers to make specific conditions or remove the licenses and things like that. Because again, going back to the hot tub thing, as Councillor Scott mentioned, it's a very different scenario if you're in a town. If your guests are then being antisocial and causing issues for the neighbours, that's obviously a problem, and you would want to restrict that. Whereas in the countryside, where your closest neighbour is 5 miles down the road, you're not going to have the same issues. So I presume then, on granting a licence, conditions in each one can be applied individually, should that be necessary.
Councillor Gegg, they would come before you as a committee.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are occasions when, and I've spoken to this before, where, you know, applicants and officers are able to agree a wording or a condition between them, and that happens not that often, but it does happen, to prevent the expense and the cost and time of going to committee if it's about quite a narrow area or something specific. But if it was something that officers do not have delegated powers in terms of standing orders to deal with, it would come before you as the committee. The mandatory conditions would always be attached, and then if you wanted to, or you considered it necessary and proportionate upon hearing everything, add some additional conditions, then that would be a matter for the committee to decide.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Brace and then Councillor Meakin.
Yes, thanks, Convener. When it comes to application fees, there's obviously a huge, well, from the information Fiona's given us, there's a huge range of difference between the fees charged for some councils and others. And my question for officers, I suppose, is there any legal requirement for us to cover full costs as we do in planning applications, I believe? And similarly, do we have the discretion to subsidise the cost of this scheme for owners? And point out too, yeah, I get what you're saying about Shetland, Fiona, but Shetland Council is in a very different financial position from Angus Council. It's probably the best off council in Scotland.
Councillor, in terms of the fees, from anywhere else. Undertaking work, and as Fiona said, as per my report, there are estimates. It's not definitive at this time. This is a completely new licensing regime. We've conducted research to try and anticipate numbers. We've looked at costings, but they have to be projected. And as you can see from the report, we've worked with finance in terms of looking at this, looking at costs, to give you the best information that we can give you at this time. It's within the report. I really haven't got anything else that I can add to that, and I would just ask members to carefully consider the detail of the report before you.
Yeah, if I can come back on that, please, Tina. So what we're saying here is that the fees that are proposed in here do not include any element of profit for Angus Council. They're purely based on officer's judgment as to what it's going to cost.
I can't confirm that at this time, Councillor
right.
Brace, because this is the best information we have available at this time. If you look at the report, it talks you through the rationale and the thinking of officers, as I said, in conjunction with finance officers, and this is the information that we have to offer you at this time. Only after a period of time will we be able to accept the applications, process the applications, and understand exactly what the costs are, what the numbers are, and then we will know. We would then at that point put it up to the committee for review.
Right, okay, thanks.
Councillor Meehan.
Thank you, Convener. I think it's quite difficult. I mean, if we have officers going away and working with our finance colleagues and coming back with, let's face it, it'll be an estimate on the likely cost to cover this scheme. It's quite difficult, I think, for us then to say, well, we've listened to professional opinion, but we've decided, no, it's not going to be that. We want it to be much cheaper, given that we can't subsidise it from elsewhere. So I'm really not sure there's a lot of argument there. I think what we've got to do is we've got to make a decision based on the information put in front of us, which has been worked on by the professionals. The other thing, though, I need to ask a question on, it's just so it's clear in my head, is that on the additional conditions, if we were to say we don't want any of them, get rid of them all, and then something came up in a town somewhere or whatever, if we didn't have those additional conditions written in, could we then enforce them if they're not there?
No.
Does that make sense?
No, councillors, this is one regime. Fiona referred to other legislative provisions that may cross over with this regime, but this is one regime that stands alone, and we're talking about the short-term lets. You know, we can't solve all ills of any of the problems that may arise. We can't solve all ills of society with one licensing regime. So if there were no additional conditions, they couldn't be enforced. But what you can look at is, in terms of 1982 Act, there's you could look at variation potentially or suspension. There are ways to bring it back before the committee for review, but that would obviously need to be evidence-based and would need to be considered on the basis of complaints or records, etc., etc. So it's not necessarily that once you grant it, say for the initial period of up to 3 years, it's not necessarily that is set in stone. You know, if there's evidence to support the need for an additional condition or a variation at a later date, then you could consider that.
Yeah.
Would it be the case then? I mean, just so I'm clear in my own head, that it would be rather like licensing, where we would have these additional conditions sitting there, but when we actually made a decision, not everyone would be, you know, oh, this condition, that the next condition. We would actually pick and choose if we thought necessary. So most applications wouldn't have any additional conditions attached to them. Is that
If you
correct?
don't, if councillors, if the committee don't think that additional conditions should be granted as standard, then only the mandatory conditions prescribed by the legislation will apply. If there are objections, if there are representations, if there's anything that comes before officers and it has to then go to committee, committee members would then need to look at the problem, consider the Scottish Government guidance, which is where these additional conditions, apart from the final two, have come from, and decide whether or not they are necessary and proportionate in the circumstances to add in. Could be different conditions, could be something that's completely different to what the Scottish Government have said. It depends on the circumstances. It just needs to be each case considered on its own individual merits and circumstances, which is what we do with every application.
Thank you.
Yeah, Councillor Whiteside.
Thanks, convener, and I think Tina's probably just answered the questions that I was going to ask. I was just concerned with Councillor Meakin's approach that we could make it too complicated and have too many of the applications coming before the Civic Licensing Committee. So if we make no additional conditions, most of the applications, I would imagine, will be granted under delegated authority, and that will keep the costs down as well and keep it as simple as possible. And like Tina says, if there's any particular issues with any application, the committee can then consider those. But just keeping it as simple as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Councillor Whiteside. And obviously this paper has got a time issue on it as well for policy that has to be agreed. And I think every case by case will be worked on as a committee and be appropriate for our rural environment. And we're also having rural committees being set up, working with Visit Angus and different other groups that could always be a group as well. So I myself would, approve the policy. Mrs. Magson, would you like to say something? You're on mute, sorry, Tina.
Apologies. I guess just in terms of procedure, can I suggest, convener, that perhaps everybody is asked if there are any further additions to this from all the presenters that have presented very helpfully today, and then members will need to look at the report, and it's very detailed in terms of what members are asked to consider. So I wonder if it's time to move to the decision making stage, but obviously everybody should be asked if they've got anything else to say.
Yeah. Do you want me to go through the recommendation?
What I would suggest, Councillor Dunno, if respectfully, is that each individual one is taken in turn. So rather than just reading them all out and saying what are the views, perhaps we can just take each one, because there's actually quite a lot of detail in the recommendations.
Yeah, Councillor Clegg.
Thank you, convener. Might I ask perhaps that we take maybe 5, maybe 10 minutes to discuss this, as there are so many in the recommendations, so just to privately discuss with ourselves in case there's any other sort of questions or things that we want to go through with that before we make any firm decisions.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. Is that okay with yourselves?
We can go into private, convener, that's absolutely fine.
I think that would be a good idea. Thank you.
Agreed.
Okay, the committee wish to adjourn for 10 or 15 minutes, which wish to do?
15
minutes. Yeah, 15 will give us enough time, I think.
Okay. So we'll stop the live stream, and Fiona and Claire would just ask you to leave the meeting. Thank you for your attendance. Okay, convener, that's the live stream started.
Okay, thank you everybody for that break. We're now going to go through the actual conditions of the and take it from there. Okay.
So convener, could we just reiterate that we're dealing with agenda item number 6 since there's been a break in the stream, and it's report number 32222, which is just short-term lets licensing regime.
The recommendations is note the terms of the Scottish Government guidance in relation to the short-term lets.
Is that agreed?
Agreed. Okay. Note the terms of the draft short-term lets policy statements, public consultation, responses and draft application form outlined in appendices 1 and 2 of the report.
Agreed.
Determine that all new grant and renewal licences should be granted for a 3-year period or specify such a shorter period as the committee deems justified and appropriate in terms of the renewal licences.
Agreed.
Everyone agreed on that one?
Agreed, but Councillor Whiteside.
Yeah,
hands up.
we could see if there's any hands up or anything. Councillor Whiteside?
Yeah, could I pose that the renewal licences are for a longer period? A period of 6 years for renewal of licences.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Okay. Do we want to vote on this now?
No, just is there any member wish to move an amendment to that?
Councillor Meehan?
I would move that we agree the 3-year in the report.
Okay. Is there any? Oh, okay. So if you only want to read out the
Sorry, did Councillor Meehan receive a second?
Yeah. No, Councillor Meehan has
I
put
will
in.
second it.
Okay,
Councillor
so
Gregg.
okay.
Sorry, Fiona.
Yeah.
For the 6 years, there will need to be some reason given as to why 6 years.
Why 6 years?
Councillor Whiteside, I don't know whether you can confirm.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. For the reason that they've gone through the application process and provided all the necessary documentation, and any problems with the let would be of the committee in the interim. If there's no problems, I think they should have the extra time to carry on the business without unnecessary fees.
Thank you, Councillor.
Okay.
Committee, we'll just go to the vote on this one. So the motion moved by Councillor Whiteside, seconded by Councillor Brays, is to renew the renewal licences be for 6 years on the reasons that she's given. The amendment moved by Councillor Meehan, seconded by Councillor Gregg, is that the renewal licences should be granted for a 3-year period as detailed in the report. The motion is for 6 years, the amendment is for 3 years.
Okay.
Councillor Convener, motion or amendment?
Amendment.
Councillor Meehan?
Amendment.
Councillor Brays?
Motion.
Councillor Gregg?
Amendment.
Councillor Melville?
Motion.
Councillor Nicholl?
Motion.
And Councillor Whiteside.
Motion.
So that's 4 for the motion and 3 for the amendment. Therefore, the motion is carried and the renewal licences are for 6 years.
Okay, that's great, thank you. The next recommendation determined whether there should or not be a temporary exemption policy, and if so, determine appropriate conditions to be attached to an exemption and the grounds for granting or refusing an application for an exemption, including any types of premises or types of licence of which an exemption would not be granted. Is that agreed? Councillor Whiteside? Bye.
I think George was first, and I think we'll have to decide whether or not. But George was before me.
Okay, sorry. I've lost George again.
Thank you, convener. Temporary exemptions seemed a bit strange, given that this policy was about safety. I'm not sure how you can give an exemption on safety. So I find it, doesn't quite fit with me that you would give an exemption when what we're talking about is basically safety. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Whiteside.
Thank you, convener. I think there is a case for temporary exemptions, just like the land board issues occasional licences, or there are occasions when the full licence isn't in place. I think we need temporary exemptions and additional, additional events that might give rise to a need for this. So I think there is a need for temporary exemptions.
Councillor Gregg.
Thank you, convener. Just for a point of clarification from Tina, with regards to the temporary exemptions, would that be, for example, if it was a glamping pod that doesn't have all the same facilities as a residential property, then they would be exempt from certain parts? Would that be my right in thinking that? No.
No, I think the report gives more detail on temporary exemptions. It's broader than that.
Councillor Whiteside, is that an old hand or is that a new hand?
Hand, sorry.
Okay. Is there anybody putting in an amendment on this recommendation?
Sorry, I was on mute. I think Councillor Meekins was saying that he did not wish to give a temporary exemption, and Councillor Whiteside was saying that she feels that we need temporary exemptions. So does Councillor Meekin have a seconder? Is there no seconder for Councillor Meekin?
Okay.
So is the view of the committee, unanimous view of the committee then, is that they require that there should be temporary exemption policy?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay. Okay. The next one is determine for the.
Sorry, apologies. The recommendation is more detailed than that, and there's more for you to consider as members.
Okay.
Fiona, do you want to read out all the other things that need to be determined by members?
Yeah, so the committee has determined that there should be a temporary exemptions policy, and if so, now that we've agreed that, we've to determine the appropriate conditions to be attached to an exemption and the grounds for granting or refusing an application for an exemption, including premises or types of licences for which an exemption would not be granted.
Okay. I'm quite happy to go with the recommendation.
Well, I think we've got a decision. We've to determine the appropriate conditions to be attached to an exemption and the grounds for granting or refusing an application for an exemption. Because the view of the committee and the agreement of the committee is that we require temporary exemption policy.
Okay.
Maybe Ms. Magson could help you on this one.
Yeah, it's a matter for members. It's before members. All the information that I have is there. Do you need to go back into private?
Am I working on point 2.5? The licence authorities may grant temporary exemptions to the requirements of a licence. They can do this for a special single continuous period, not exceeding 6 weeks. In any period of 12 months, the 6-week limit is maximum. In order to obtain a temporary exemption from the requirement to have a licence, hosts and operators must apply for a temporary exemption where it is offered by a licensing authority. Police Scotland and Scottish Fire result would be consulted with this. licensing authorities must publish a temporary exemptions policy statement on their website and keep it under review. Members are asked to consider again the aims of the new scheme as narrated in 2.4 of the report and decide whether to permit temporary exemptions. If considered appropriate, members are asked to identify appropriate conditions to be attached to any exemption on the grounds for granting or refusing an application, including any types of premises or types of licence of which an exemption would not be granted. Where a licensing authority does not wish to use the powers to grant any exemptions, you can comply with the duty by publishing the statement on that applications for exemptions will not be granted under any circumstances. So could we do that at a later date? Could we publish on our website?
Well, you'll see, members, that there's a requirement to do it by the 1st of October.
Could that be done?
So you would want to defer this question to another committee before the 1st of October.
I think that would probably be appropriate.
Okay.
Okay,
So you're going to make the decision today that you want to have a temporary exemption, but you want officers, if you direct officers as to exactly what information you're looking for, we can bring a report back. But the committee, I think you're thinking, is the 29th. Is that correct, Fiona?
Yes, if we need a special committee, we could have one on Thursday, the 29th of September. There's no meetings that day.
I think that would be appropriate. Councillor Whiteside, are you in agreement with this?
Yeah, I just didn't want to shut down the possibility of a temporary exemption if that was required. So I want to keep that option open. So if we can do that by clarifying the conditions, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is that agreed by everybody?
Agreed.
Yeah.
So we're happy to defer that part to a special civic licensing board, which will be held on Thursday, I think the 29th of September.
Okay, I'm kind of losing the place of you, but I think I'm on determining whether there should or not be a temporary licensing policy, and if so, determine any additional conditions to be attached to a licence and the licensing criteria for issuing temporary licenses. Is that right? I am on the right bit.
Yeah, that's fine. So that's that recommendation. So we're now on recommendation 5 in the report.
Yeah.
Should determine whether there should or should not be a temporary licence policy. And again, if the committee agree that there should be a temporary licence policy, you would have to determine any additional conditions to be attached to this licence criteria for using temporary licences. So first of all, it's a bit of a two-stage recommendation. So first of all, you're deciding whether there should or should not be a temporary licence policy.
I think temporary licensing for accommodation might be quite difficult to implement, really, because you have all the procedures to take place. Would it be something that somebody would go through all that procedures just for a temporary licence? Myself, I'm thinking that, but Councillor Whiteside?
Again, I would be shut down the possibility, and I think the temporary licence could be in place while a full licence is being considered. So I would like to keep that possibility open. Perhaps we could determine the conditions at the same time as the last recommendation.
Yeah, that sounds like a plan. Councillor Meehan?
I would agree with Councillor Whiteside on this one.
Okay.
I think it's a good idea to have it. Somebody missed the water, if you like, and see if it's something they want to do. So I fully agree with Councillor Whiteside.
Okay, thank you. So this is similar to the other recommendation that we're looking at this at another, or do we just agree this at the moment?
No, I think Councillor Whiteside, what we're agreeing, I think what I'm gathering from the board, it seems to be a unanimous decision that we're agreeing that there should be a temporary licence policy. But again, I think I would gather you wish to take these conditions to the Special Civic Licensing Committee.
Yeah.
It's agreed.
It's agreed. Right. The next one is note the statutory requirements to ensure that the total amount of fees receivable by the authority is sufficient to meet the expenses of the authority. That's something we've discussed. Is that agreed? Okay. Identify any amendments that are required to be made to the policy or application form, and therefore agree the final version of the short-term lets policy statement and the application form. And this is wanted to.
Jumped ahead.
I think you've missed a couple of recommendations.
Have I missed one? We've done the fees. Next one is determine whether to set additional license conditions to be attached to all licenses standard.
No, I think,
What one have I missed?
is it Appendix 3? Is
7.
it? Yeah.
7, yeah.
Yeah, Appendix. We're considering the fees contained in Appendix 3 of the report. That's on page 96 of the report.
Yeah.
That was the fees detailed in Appendix 3, and determine the fees and charges.
Oh, okay. I thought we'd agreed that. Thank you. But obviously haven't. Right. Okay. Councillor Meehan.
I think given that the only information we have to hand is that which has been done by the officers, it seems difficult to decide anything else. I mean, we would just be making it up. So in my opinion, we would have to go at this point in time, find out, you know, what it's going to be like after a year. We would have to go with the fees that have been proposed.
Yeah, I agree with you. Councillor Brace.
Yes, well, I would agree with Councillor Meehan on this entirely, because our professional officers have looked at this and this is what they've come up with. I don't really see how any member of this committee can come up with a figure today that's worked out in any way whatsoever. So I think we really have to go with this.
Yeah. Councillor Melville.
Yeah, it's a question really. It's just about how soon are we as a committee able to review these fees? And because obviously we know that we're not going to have the detailed information about it for 1, maybe 2 years. So would it be possible to set as an aim that we would review the fees after a period of 2 or 3 years and see where we are at that point?
I think that's a possibility. Is that not, Mrs. Madsen?
You can certainly say in your recommendation that you want it brought back for reconsideration effectively when more information is known.
Okay, thank you.
What I would perhaps suggest, Councillor Melville, I don't know whether this would be acceptable, is that all licences require to have been processed by the 1st of July 2024. So that would kind of encapsulate the first tranche of new and existing application. Perhaps we'll have them through much quicker than that, but I don't know whether that might be a suitable time or a year to look at. You'll have information at that point.
Okay. Okay. Are we okay with the recommendations then that we just discussed?
So could I just clarify with the committee then that they've considered the fees contained in Appendix 3 and agreed that to adopt these fees that are in Appendix 3, but that they reserve the right to review these fees for when more information is known, and maybe no later than the 1st of July 2024?
Yeah.
Yes, that would seem sensible to me, no later than.
Okay. Right. Okay.
So it's number 8, convener, and this is where you have to determine whether to set additional licence conditions to the attached to all licences as standard.
I don't think we want to set additional licence conditions to the attached to all licences as standard.
Agreed.
Can I suggest, members, that the temporary exemptions and the temporary licences are continued for consideration in amongst the 29th of September committee? Because it does say all licences there. It's just, I'm mindful that you have actually continued consideration of those ones.
Yeah, that would be great. So can we put that in the proper speak? Could Mrs. Anderson read that out into the appropriate wording, please, for me?
So Tina, I'm sure I'll keep my right here. So we're determining what we've determined not to set additional conditions. So that will just be to the normal licenses. Tina, is that correct? Rather than any temporary or exemption ones.
No additional conditions as standard to all applications. apart from pending consideration of the temporary exemptions and temporary licenses. Does that wording meet with approval? I think it's just because you have determined to move those on at a later date.
Yeah, that's great. As long as it all makes sense to everybody else, that's fine. Thank you.
The committee agreed that. Okay.
Okay, nearly there. Identify any amendments that require to be made to policy or any application form, and therefore agree the final version of the short-term lets policy statement and application form. And delegate authority to the Director of Legal and Domestic Services to establish, maintain and publish a register of licences, and therefore amend the Council's scheme of governments in that regard.
So sorry, if we go back, convener, to number 9, so are the committee happy to agree the final version of the short-term letting policy statement that's attached to the report and the application form, which was also attached to the report?
Yeah.
Are there any changes that members want? So additional conditions should be removed. That section should be adjusted to cover what you've just decided in terms of not having any additional as standard. I highlighted and read a number of issues that were raised by the public consultation and have been mirrored today. Things like so for example, if you go to the application form, you don't want, I don't know, but hardwired smoke alarms didn't seem to be meeting with approval. So it would just be, there are smoke alarms that they don't need to be hardwired. So I would just ask if there's anything like that. I'll need direction from you. It's your decision as to what to take out and what to leave.
Right, Councillor Whiteside.
It was like the smoke alarms and also the detail on the plans, the specification of the plans required.
Yeah.
Councillor Meakin.
It was on the application form. I wonder if we could take out maiden name and actually put in, previous names or anything like that. Maiden name seems a bit.
I'll double check, Councillor Meakin, that it is specified in the Act, but if it can be taken out, I'll take it out.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have anything they want to put in or take out? No.
So that's the smoke alarms, the hardwired part of it, take out, and the details on the plan so far. And Councillor Meakin's, the maiden name, Tina's going to look at that part of it.
Yeah, Councillor Craig.
Thank you, Convener. And just again with regards to application form, I'm quickly flicking through it. Sort of going in tandem with smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors. Obviously, there will be some places that don't have gas, but they do use wood burners or things, so that might be something to perhaps include as well.
So add that.
Yeah.
Add that in.
Yeah, carbon monoxide detectors.
Don't know if there's a hand up. I don't know who that is.
I think it's actually Fiona Campbell.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but those are part of the fire safety legislation already. So that would be duplicating existing legislation. All of that's within existing fire regs.
Lovely. Thank you for that.
Anything else, members?
No, I think that's it.
If you would like me to, given that we have the the committee on the 29th, would you prefer that I bring back an amended policy that you can, with all the amendments that you have indicated here, and then you can do a final sign off on that day? Would that be of assistance?
Yes,
okay.
That would be much clearer. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's just the final recommendation, convener, which is number 10.
Yeah. The delegates authority to the Director of Legal and Democratic Services to establish, maintain and publish a register of licences, and so to therefore amend the Council's scheme of governments in that regard. Is that the right one? Yep.
Agreed.
Great, thank you.
Fine, and that's the end of this item.
I think that's been the longest thing I've ever done in the last 5.5 years. I can't remember ever having to do this for such a long time. Okay. I'd just like to thank everybody that's taken part in this decision making just now, and for all the people that's come into this live stream. Right, let's see where we are now. We're now moving on to the temporary exemption. Hang on, I'm losing my place here. Let me just find out where we are, because we've been such a long time on this. It's such a big
Convener, we're on a page 104. It's
Yeah.
item 7, and it's the animal boarding licensing.
Thank you for that. Okay. I realised that that paper was so big. It's so much easier when you're not on a laptop, isn't it? Bear with me a minute so I get it up in front of me. Okay, here we go. Item 7. Animal boarding licenses. Recommendations. Everybody read the recommendations, or do you want me to read them out? I read the recommendations out. It is recommended that the committee considers whether to commence a review of the processes and documentation with respect to licensing animal boarding establishment in terms of the Animal Boarding Establishments Act 1963, and if the committee agrees to review, delegate authority to the Director of Legal and Democratic Services to commence such a review in liaison with Environmental Health and to report back to the committee on progress in due course. Is that agreed?
Yeah. I think convener, again, we've got to decide whether to commence a review of its process. Don't know what the committee's views is.
Any thoughts from the board members? Councillor Meehan?
I have no issues. I think, yes, we should commence a review of the process. I also would state that I agree with delegate authority to the Director of Legal to do so.
Yeah. Councillor Melville?
Yeah, I'm happy to second that if that's necessary, convener.
Okay. Thank you. Is that agreed? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Right, thank you for that. We're now excluding the public and press.
So if we just convener agree that committee asked to, in terms of standing order 28, to exclude the public and press from the proceedings now. Is that agreed?
Yep, thank you.
Agreed.
Okay, and we'll stop the live stream.